Okay, we're going to get started. I'm sure that there will be some other people joining as we go, but we'd like to honor everybody's time. So thank you for joining us tonight. I know it's a really nice night, and so for some of you, you've maybe made the choice to stay inside and participate in this learning tonight, so we appreciate that. On behalf of the participating schools of Blake and Pape and Leslieville and Earl Grey and East, we would like to welcome Julia. She is here to present to us tonight, and she is a recent graduate from the University of Toronto. She studied all of the things, as we discussed. So diasporic and transnational studies, women's studies, and Indigenous studies. And so we are looking forward to hearing from her tonight and walking us through this journey. She will also be the one presenting at our session in June. So thank you, Julia, for being here tonight. For everybody, just so you know, we are recording the session, and we will be sharing that recording out so that it can be shared with those who weren't able to attend, or if you do need to duck out early, you can watch the remainder of the presentation. So I'll turn it over to you, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. So like what was said, my name is Julia. My pronouns are she and her, and I'll be facilitating this history of colonization workshop with all of you today. And just before we get started, I have some digital housekeeping stuff that we like to do with all of our online workshops. So if you're comfortable, you can change your name on your Zoom account to include your pronouns, and to change your name with how you would like to be referred to throughout this workshop. And by doing that, you just hover over your video screen and 3 little dots will come up and you'll see rename. I also really encourage using the chat function throughout this workshop. You can use it to engage with me or engage with each other. Private message me at any time if you need to say something. If you'd like to speak, you can use the raise your hand or clap function, and hopefully I will see it. If not, you can also always interrupt me. I really welcome that. And microphone and video muting is in the lower left-hand corner of your Zoom screen. And subtitles, you'll see a small white box with 2 C's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And with that button, you can turn on subtitles. They're not the best. Sometimes they mess up words, but hopefully they will help if you need that or if that's helpful for you. I also invite you to prepare yourself and your space in being present today. This might look like removing distractions like your phone, but I always like to remind that your family, your friends, your roommates, your pets are not distractions. I know that we're in a very weird digital time right now, and not everyone has the privilege of privacy in their own home. So like I said, friends, family, pets, those are all very welcome. You might also want to get a beverage or note-taking stuff if that is helpful to you. And just a reminder to center yourself throughout the workshop. This might look like taking a break. If some of the material is a bit triggering, it might get there. And that's okay. I trust you to know yourself and to know your boundaries. And I promise it won't offend me if you'd like to leave the workshop early. If the information is too heavy, that's completely fine. Centering yourself also looks like going to the bathroom when you need to go to the bathroom, or keeping your video off if that makes you more comfortable. Like as a facilitator, I love to see your faces, but I will also never ask you to keep your video on. And before we get started today, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. So during these virtual times, let's take a moment to honor and acknowledge the land we are on. I have a complicated relationship with this country, as I'm sure many of us do, with the original stewards of this land, specifically the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit, have resisted the Canadian government's best efforts to completely colonize where we stand. This acknowledgement is specific to Toronto, a land that is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee people the Dutch that has been extended to all newcomers. Although I know that this extension is a lot more complicated than that, it's still an urgent call to action for us to uphold any and all direction from Indigenous people on how to interact with the land that we are currently on. Toronto is also governed by the Turo Wampum. The central teaching of this one is that we move through the river of life on two separate boats, never interfering with each other and never crossing each other's paths. We don't act as parent and child, but siblings. And that this is important to my work because I choose lateral love every time and try to remove as many power structures in my work as possible. I encourage you to take a moment and reflect on the land that you are currently on and what you know about it. And I'll take a little pause right here. Okay, thank you. We can get into our agenda for today. So first we'll start off with some introductions. I'll properly introduce myself. We'll do a reflection activity, we'll have a break, and then we'll get into a timeline exercise and then have some time for discussion and questions. So this is a positioning statement, which is something I always like to do before I start workshops, so you all know where I'm coming from. So hi, my name is Julia, like Megan introduced me as. My pronouns are she and her. I'm currently residing in Toronto, and I was born and raised in Brampton, Ontario. I'm from Filipino and Italian descent. I'm a settler in Treaty 14 territory. Some identities I carry are that I'm 22 years old, I have invisible disabilities, I'm a second generation migrant, bisexual and child free. I'm also a light-skinned person of color, lower middle class, employed, and I'm also a survivor and have the privilege of having a degree in women and gender studies, diasporic and transnationalism studies, and Indigenous studies. Some roles I hold within community are friend, daughter, cousin, sibling, accomplice, auntie, artist, poet, and educator, as I'm acting as today. Officially at Canadian Roots Exchange, I am the Community Engagement Specialist. So I'll also introduce the organization that I work for, which is Canadian Roots Exchange. So we're a registered charity that provides Indigenous-based leadership, learning, and reconciliation experiences to every youth that participates in our program. I know that you all might not think of yourselves as youth, but for today, I'm going to refer to you as youth. CRE organizes three main types of activities. So we do leadership training programs, workshops like this one here today, and gatherings. And now for a quick moment, I'd just like you all to introduce yourself. So if you feel comfortable in the chat, you can type your name, pronouns, and where you're from. Okay, great. I know that we're almost all from Toronto with the TDSB, right? That's good to know. Okay. So these are our group agreements for today. These are just like guidelines that are gonna help us with thinking about how we're gonna interact with each other today. So I'll go through a couple of them with you. One of them is alone we know less, together we know more. So I always like to remind people who are participating in my workshops that I'm not an expert on any of this information, and all of the workshops at CRE are reciprocal learning experiences. So hopefully I will learn things from you and hopefully you will learn things from me. Another one is question the idea, not the person. try not to make judgments or assumptions about who a person is. I promise that I won't make any judgments about who you are, and I hope that you'll extend the same type of kindness to me and other people in this workshop. One mic, one voice, which I know is hard in these Zoom times, but I also think the talking over each other is like a funny human thing that I'm really missing at this time. So all of those little slip ups are very welcome. Just taking a little patience. Confidentiality, so stories stay and lessons leave. We might share some personal stories throughout this workshop, and those I'd like to keep within the circle. But lessons, the things that we learn together here, I would love for you to share with your kids, with your friends, with your family. Consent. So I'm never going to ask you to share something that you don't feel like sharing. I'm never going to ask you to do something like keep your video on if you don't want to. Those are all things that are up to you. And again, if you ever feel like you would be better suited leaving this space, please do that. That's up to you. Double checking pronouns. So if a person has put their pronouns in their name, please respect those and double check them before you refer to someone. And another one is approach your edges. So if you listen lots, try to speak up. And if you speak a lot, try to listen. Are we all cool with these? You can give me a thumbs up or a reaction. And again, this is a living document. So if we ever need to return to this, if we ever need to add things to this, we will do that. We can always come back to this slide. Okay, so the workshop, History of Colonization. It's a huge topic, and I'm really happy to see so many people here wanting to learn about the colonization of Canada. So we're gonna look at the histories of colonization as experienced by various Indigenous communities on this land. And we'll connect these things to what happened in history and to things that are going on now. We'll focus on learning how systems, policies, and laws are connected to discrimination that people experience every day by looking at historical events and what that means for what we're living through right now. This first activity is our little introduction. So I'm going to send you all out into breakout rooms of 2 or 3, and you'll be asked to share the following questions, or share your answers on the following questions. So the first one is, what is colonization? You don't need to know like a textbook definition for this, just what you think colonization is. How have you, your ancestors, or your family experienced colonization? And how do you continue to experience this? So I'm gonna send you prompts. You'll see like a little notification at the top of your screen as we're going along. I usually think of it as like each person has about a minute to share their answers. And I will be reminding you of these questions throughout this workshop as well. Does anyone have any questions about this activity before I send you out into breakout rooms? We're good? Okay, cool. So I will send you all out and then I'll be prompting you to answer these questions. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that experience. And I would love to hear back from some of you about what you all talked about. This is the definition that's most commonly used for colonization. And I'll read it out to you. It's the process of assuming control of someone else's territory by applying one's own systems of law, government, and religion. I think that this definition could use a lot of work. I think there's a lot of things missing from it. And I'm curious to see if anyone has things that they'd want to add. Feel free to unmute yourself.
I just noted that it is like imperialistic in nature and that it's all about building empires and not really worrying about who was there before because they're really just worried about how that new territory can benefit them as an empire.
Mhm. That's a great thing to add. I think imperialist is a word that we use a lot, and sometimes people might not know what it means. And I think imperial has the underlying idea that your way of life, your philosophies, your knowledge are the right ones, and that it's a practice of imposing those beliefs on other people. Does anyone else have any ideas of what might be added to this definition? Maybe what you talked about?
I was just going to say one of the things that's sort of explicitly missing from the definition is the dynamic of power. So kind of talking about process of assuming control, but that requires a level of power and white supremacy. And I would say that seems to be missing from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, power is definitely a big concept that's missing. I think a lot of times people stray away from adding the process of genocide into the definition of colonization, which it definitely needs to be there. Usually, when we put on this workshop for kids, I don't use the word genocide so abruptly, but since we're all adults here, that I can use a word like that. Um, but yeah, power is definitely a huge part of colonization that we often forget sometimes.
Yeah, it also doesn't really cover like by whatever means necessary, like the violence of it all.
Mm-hmm. I also think we often think of colonization as something that happened. There was one moment in time where colonization was being enacted in Canada, and we don't normally think of it as an ongoing process that continues to happen every day. By whatever means necessary. I like that phrase.
I would also say the idea of exploitation,
Mm-hmm.
something that you could include in the definition.
Definitely. And I also think exploitation comes along with a lot of the experiences of non-Indigenous people to Turtle Island. So me, for example, I'm non-Indigenous, so I don't identify with being a part of any nation in Canada, but I am Filipino. And the exploitation aspect of colonization is something that's very powerful to me because the Philippines is so exploited for its resources, its labor. And I'm sure if you think back to the other non-Indigenous people in this room of your countries, and if they were colonized, what does exploitation look like in that country? And what does it look like here, right? How about the other questions about how you experience colonization or how your family has experienced it? Does anyone feel like sharing? An example I always like to bring up is that I am half white, actually. My dad is Italian. And he was born in Toronto, but my grandfather, my nonno, wasn't. He was born in Italy and moved to Canada. And I think a lot of people forget the experience of becoming a settler. When he lived in Italy, he was not a settler. If he had moved to a country that was not colonized, like for example, if he had moved to England, he would not become a settler. But by moving to Canada, by moving to settler colonial nation states, you become a settler.
I had shared in our breakout group, and with suggestion, a nice nudge from Valerie, she said I should share. I'm in a very unique position in that I am half Irish Scottish and I'm half Mohawk. So I really have both sides of the spectrum, all sides of the spectrum. I am very, I have really benefited from white privilege in my life in that I am very white presenting. So I've never had, I've never struggled from that that point of view, that perspective, the way that, you know, a very large part of my ancestry and my family has. I still have family who live on the reserve in Tyendinaga, and it's only been in very recently that I've started doing the work and looking into that part of my heritage and my ancestry, and really seeing the ways that I have and continue to benefit from colonialism and settlers, and it's just really interesting and very profound to kind of see it from both sides, being that I've really benefited from this this society that has been built on all of these atrocities and this horrible history that, you know, is Canada, Toronto, all of it. And it's such a learning curve to kind of break away from this mindset that I've grown up with. I grew up with the very white side of my family, and so, you know, you don't learn about any of it in any real depth, or I didn't growing up in school. And so it's been my privilege to try to take that on as an adult and dig deeper and learn more and really try to educate myself and my kids too.
Hmm.
So
Thank you for sharing that with us and also being here today. Yeah, I think the experience of existing in a settler colonial nation
Love you, Spency. Kiss.
is nothing but complicated
Kiss.
and like extremely complex. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. Does anyone else have anything to share before we move on to our next thing? Okay, there's one last thing that I'd like to share. I think as a young person myself, and as like from experience of doing these workshops with lots of youth, is that like the concept of colonization is really, really big and really, really hard to understand. And every time I have done this workshop with every single age range you could imagine, the same questions always get brought up about what even is colonization. I mean, I have a whole bachelor's degree in this, and I don't really fully know. I think it's a very intensely complex thing to understand, and that we're all here learning together, and that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. So our next activity is a break. So take the next 5 minutes to just break, have a body break, go to the bathroom if you need, get up and stretch. Okay, welcome back, everybody. If you could signal that you're back to me, like a reaction or turning your video back on, that would be great. Okay, I think majority of us are back. I'll start sharing my screen again. So this is where we're going to get into a lot of the content of this workshop, which I'll be sharing a timeline activity with a bunch of different events throughout the history of colonization in Canada. So you'll see in the chat that I just sent out a link to a document. You can open that up onto your computer. You can save this document and look back to it at whatever time. So you'll be sent out into breakout rooms, and in these rooms, you'll look at a set of events in Canadian history. So each of you will have a specific group color that's set out within this document. And you'll read out each of the events in your specific section. Choose one of the events to discuss the impact of it. And your group name will correspond to the section of the document. So when I send you out into breakout rooms, make sure you double check to see which room I'm sending you out into. And if you have any questions, you can always ask for help from within the breakout room or come back to the main room and I'll come and help you out. So I'll just go through this document with you. This is our timeline activity. Here are the instructions that I just laid out for you, but there's some questions to kind of help guide your discussion, which are, did you know about this particular event previous to this workshop? Was it a policy? Was it a law? Maybe an act of discrimination or an act of resilience? Or was it maybe a mixture of these things? How is the event related to something currently happening in our communities? And what did this event mean for the people who experienced it? You will be asked to present some of this information to the bigger circle. This is a lot of like school vibes. This is what your kids do on a regular basis. So I hope you enjoy doing an activity like this. I always know I love to. It makes me feel like I'm back in high school again. And yeah, does anyone have any questions before I send you out? If you do have any questions at any point, feel free to use the ask for help button or just come back to the main room. Okay, and I'll send you all out. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that little schooly activity. So now I want to have some time to hear back from you all about what you talked about and maybe like little presentation styles about the events that you were asked to read. So I think I'll just like call out the group names unless there's a group that wants to go first. Okay, group red.
Okay, I was nominated to speak. So you want me to speak to like all the different articles or the one that we chose, or?
It's more up to you. You can talk about the one that you chose so we can hear like the impacts that you decided.
Okay, I mean, the one we chose to talk about was residential schools. It was related to the timeline and some of that stuff. Like that, the last one closed in 1996. We also had some really other. Are you going to share the articles or no?
Yeah, I'll share it right now.
There was one of the things that was really interesting was like the killing of 20,000 dogs, the Inuit people's sled dogs, which just like devastated their way of life and their connection to communities, their lifestyle, their hunting, navigating, all those kinds of things that would have been really crucial. We read about the British North American Acts, seal hunting bans, stereotyping that happened where a man who was an Inuk from Nunavut was arrested by the RCMP, and they put him in a cell because they thought he was drunk, but he had actually was having a stroke. And so it was just like this example of how deadly stereotyping can be. And then we started talking about residential schools from the 1950s. So we talked about the impact of that on Canada and how it was really like a tool to erase and get rid of the genocide of a whole group of people so that Canada could establish itself. If things had been done more like, I don't know, it would be a whole different way of life in this country had things been done honorably, like with the honoring of the agreements that were made and stuff like that. So, and then we talked about how colonization. We had so much conversation about residential schools and colonization.
It's okay. I'm glad you had conversations. If there's like a question that's coming to my mind, is like if we want to connect what happened in residential schools to what's happening now. Like what kind of connections can we draw? What kind of connections are there to the current lived experiences of Indigenous people and even settlers? Like how do we still see residential schools?
Is that for everyone?
Yeah,
now?
anyone can
Yeah.
answer or you'd like to answer.
Yeah.
Well, we also talked about the impact of residential schools now and how that's impacted the ability, well, the cultural genocide and the genocide of actual people, and then how it's impacted their ability to thrive or even, you know, survive currently in society, right? And how far behind it's put peoples. And then I shared a link because there's actually certain resources like CBC has a map that you can look up different residential schools across the country so you can understand the residential schools that may be close to like here, for example, where we are, and sort of draw the connection. We were really struck by the fact that the last residential school closed in 1996, which is within most of our lifetimes. And then we talked a little bit about the Truth and Reconciliation report too, and which is related to that.
So actually a fun fact about CRE is that our funding is a direct response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was a report that was made by and for residential school survivors and comes with 99 calls to action for all Canadians as well as the Canadian government. So yeah, the TRC is actually why and the motivating force behind workshops like this. I think that residential schools really live on in all of our lives, and it's a focus that Ontario and nationally schools don't focus on a lot. And I do think it's really important for kids and for everyone to know what happened in these schools. Does anyone else have anything to say about residential schools, or can we move on to Group Green?
I just wanted to say that I was at a workshop. Hi, I'm Dana. A workshop from the Urban Indigenous Education Center, and just one of the statistics that they were speaking about that took me aback was the numbers in the foster care system right now in Ontario and Toronto are so incredibly are so it's filled with Indigenous children. And it was a quote, I can't remember it right now, so I shouldn't even try, but something about Indigenous children spending some incredibly long number of years in foster care, and that it was a direct connection to the residential school, because these were all grandchildren and children of the trauma of all of that, and that it's still very, very, very much alive. That trauma is still very much present.
Yeah,
so it was just a new realization for me that really made a difference in my brain.
I think that when we're thinking about the connections to what's happening right now, the way that my brain works is looking at themes. So a theme of residential schools was the separation of families. And then we see that same theme in taking Indigenous children into foster care systems. It's that same type of motivation, that same type of desire of the Canadian government to do that we see repeated. So even though residential schools aren't happening now, they're still very much alive. Maybe we'll move on to Group Green. If anyone wants to share about what you talked about. Oh, sorry. I forgot that Group Green was closed. That's my bad. I'm so sorry about that. We'll move on to Group Blue then.
Hi. So Jen and I did we're Group Blue. So there was a lot to take in, and we tried to talk a little bit about everything. The thing that we mostly wanted to focus on from that was the health racism, because that really felt like it was the predominant theme of our group. Like everything in there really highlighted, I would say, predominantly um, the disproportionate way in which Indigenous women and Indigenous women's health is negatively impacted and affected, historically speaking, but also, very much in present day. There are just so many accounts and histories of this happening. As recently, I think the last article I read was 2019 or 2018, forced sterilizations under duress of Indigenous women, and I'm sorry, I'm getting all of the things that we talked about are kind of, just trying to get out. But overall, it just is such a prevalent issue, and it really is. Overall, it's the erasure of an entire group of people, and just completely trying to eradicate
Mhm.
the Indigenous populations of this country, and right from the source. And especially given that Indigenous cultures, a lot of them are matriarchal societies, and the power dynamic within those cultures generally is, female dominant, and they really hold such a high place of respect. They're givers of life, and that connection is so important. And to inflict these sterilizations on women is it's just the most insane violation. And it really, the fact that it's still going on is just mind boggling. And
Mhm.
even just women, Indigenous women and Indigenous people in general, just not being taken seriously, for their health concerns. And as Ian mentioned before, Jen and I actually talked about, the gentleman going in and having seizures, and them assuming he was drunk. And we, just talked about the fact that it is so bigoted and skewed in our healthcare system. And even professionals who are working within the healthcare industry who are discriminated against, nurses, doctors, and just not taken seriously. It's just a huge, overwhelming, glaring, awful stain on, this history of Canada. And just what's currently happening is, it's awful.
I would say that I liked your use of the word violation. I think that that's a big concept that it's hard to get your mind around, that the government does things that are violations, especially when we think of Canada as like a progressive country, as like a country that has a lot of human rights. But there are these things that are hard to think about, that bring up a lot of hard feelings when you read them, when you know about them. And I think that was a big jump that I had to get over, of like the overwhelming aspect of knowing these things. And it's a hard one, but we move on, we go through life. And I think to bring it back to what we talked about with the last group is that separation aspect. How is sterilization of women just another method of separation? And like, think about those themes, think about how they keep coming up, and think about how they're ingrained in the actions of Canada against Indigenous people. We will go on to the next group, which is group yellow.
We're all waiting for who's going to go. Dana, take it away, Dana. You're on mute.
Well, yes, I'm on mute. Sorry, here I am. We just went through them all and had a hard time coming to one because we just sort of noticed the incredible, how hundreds of years is what we're talking about. Because in our section, there's the railroad and the Chinese in the 1880s, with thousands of Chinese laborers being brought to Canada and killed and harmed and exploited. And INAC splitting into in 2017 into two different separate ministries, which is really very recent: Indigenous Affairs and Indigenous Services, which separates land and treaty rights from social and spiritual life, denying the interconnected relationship between land and community, which just for me personally, I've been learning as much as I can about agriculture, Indigenous agriculture, and just the idea that you would try and stop that connection from existing inside the community seems disgusting. That's the word I'm going to use. I don't have anything profound to say. The one we focused on was the very last one here, which was about the passes, having to have a pass system to leave. You're not allowed to leave your reserve without obtaining a pass. And I did know about the reserve status cards and things like that, but I didn't know about this specific system other than what I'd read in a few books. But something that struck me in this was that when they were setting up the system in South Africa as apartheid, that they came here to learn from our system of this, which was just a connection that blows my mind a little bit, to be honest. It's not, and we spoke a little bit about what's happening in Gaza right now, and just how this is all this system is all, to me, and just we spoke about the power of it, the manipulation of it, the making other people feel like they aren't good enough or smart enough to take care of themselves, that they need white people to go in and tell them when they can do things and when they can go places, and just the power and constant degradation of the people.
Yeah,
that's all I can really say about what we talked about.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point with the pass system, and with South Africa and looking at the Canadian system. So I think a lot of times we look at countries that are very often portrayed as having really bad human rights. And then as Canadians, we look at these countries and say, oh, at least we're not them. And I remember when I learned this as well, that I was really shocked. But we can't look at other countries before looking at our own, and seeing and knowing how these systems created the country that we see now. It's not just that these are like examples of bad events within Canadian history. It's that this is what Canada is founded upon, and is what makes up Canada as a country. Maybe we'll go to group purple. I do want to recognize the time that we have 7 minutes left technically in this session, and we have 3 more groups that need to go. So if we could keep things a little bit shorter, or I'm happy to stay a little bit longer if you're wanting to keep having conversations, but yeah, just to keep that in mind.
All right, I will try to go quickly. Again, there was just there were so many things, and so many of them were very, very interesting. The two-row wampum, and I know we're going to talk about that in the next session. So maybe I'll save that one for then. The one that we chose to speak about was Ipperwash, the Ipperwash crisis in 1995. And the reason we chose that was because Megan and I grew up not too far away from Ipperwash. I grew up a little bit closer, so we were both in high school when the crisis happened. Brent is from Alberta, so like he like knew the name but didn't really remember much about it. But essentially, what it comes down to is land rights. And after the Oka crisis in 1990, you know, the Stony Creek and the Kettle Point had grown frustrated with the Canadian government not upholding their end of the deal, basically, which was to return the land that they had expropriated during World War II. And so they occupied it, and it was occupied for a while, actually. It was a couple of years, if I remember correctly. And then Mike Harris was not a fan because it was a provincial park that they were occupying. So despite it being a federal matter, because it was a treaty issue and the federal government and the military are the ones who had the deal with the local Chippewa, the OPP at the direction of Mike Harris went in on a raid and ended up with, after an exchange of gunfire and between the Indigenous and the OPP, Dudley George was killed. He was murdered. There was an inquiry. It, you know, basically confirmed that yes, the provincial government and the OPP were at fault. They had no jurisdiction there. Sorry. And so, yeah, it just really, I remember when Dudley George was killed, it was a huge thing. Like, he was the first Indigenous person who'd been killed in a land claim in like 100 years in Canada. So the violence of it was quite shocking, and woke up a whole generation, I think, of people, both Indigenous and settler, to see the seriousness of land claims. And I think that continues on. I think the spirit of that continues on, and the struggle for land claims continues. And we're seeing that today with Land Back Lane in Caledonia, and how they're just be like, we're supposed to get this land back. It has been disputed forever, and negotiations are getting nowhere. The government of Canada is just, you know, choosing to be silent. So we're gonna take it back then. And so far, it's been able to be done peacefully, and I hope that that's how it continues. But yeah, I think that the spirit of claiming your land and taking it back without waiting for a bureaucracy is something that the Ipperwash crisis and Oka before it really inspired, which I you know,
Yeah.
which is a plus.
Something I always like to bring up when we talk about land claims is that when you read about them in the media, they can seem really, really complicated. And then you'll try and do your own research and it'll seem even more complicated. And I always just want to point out that complication, the complexity of land claims, is done on purpose. It's very complex and almost unreadable for a very specific reason, and that's to make land claims harder to prove. Maybe we want to go on to Group Orange.
Okay. Yes, Group Orange. We basically talked about them all and answered all of the questions. I guess I guess we can talk about the railway construction. How is that railway construction related to something that's currently happening in our communities? What happened there was railway was constructed. It gave settlers more access to the caribou, and within a few years, they wiped out the supply of caribou, which was devastating to the community there. How is this event related to something that's currently happening? Well, we have many hydroelectric projects where they dam up rivers, affecting the food supply for First Nations, particularly fishing. Other infrastructure, other like capitalist projects such as mining, also leaks poisons into onto indigenous land, threatening water and food. So the idea um, of settlers impacting the food and water supply of indigenous nations that was happening in 1898 continues to happen today.
And I think this is specific with Mi'kmaq people. And I think like a really, really current example is the fishing crisis happening also with Mi'kmaq people. So we see something that happened in 1898 still happening right now, almost or over 100 years later, and the exact same thing is happening yet again. So I always like to bring up the question, why is this still happening? How is this still allowed to happen? What are the conditions that the Canadian government creates to make sure that these things continue to happen? Those are like questions that you would want to ask yourself. In group Aqua, our last group.
Okay, so that was Melissa and I. Or Melissa, that was Melissa and me. So we chose, a lot of these were related, obviously, like a lot of people have found in the ones that they did, but we chose to focus on the Walking with Our Sisters. We had both heard of it. It very much went into like the Tina Fontaine and the other ones above. So we had both heard of it before, but we didn't know the detail of it. We were both aware that it was an art installation, but we're both under the impression that it was something you went to see, whereas it ends up, it's actually something you experience. You walk the path with the moccasins, and that was we felt that quite impactful. In terms of what it was definitely, we perceived it as an act of resilience. Thousands of wrongdoings to women and First Nations and Indigenous people across our country. And it's a problem that's not really going away, that there's disenfranchisement, and there are people that go missing all the time, that the perception is they're not really missed, so that they don't really matter, because we don't really even notice that they're gone, and that's obviously incredibly problematic. In terms of likening it to today, what's going on today, we were talking about the ongoing inquiry with Joyce Echaquan, the woman in northern Quebec who was treated horribly by the hospital staff and essentially left to die. And I know yesterday it was horrific, because they talked to, or on the stand was one of the orderlies, and they didn't even really didn't seem to accept that the words they said were even harmful. I mean, I think they said something like, well, I could have been more delicate. So there's clearly, even after all this press, there's clearly a disconnect between her actions and how she treated somebody who was in the care of, again, a government organization, which clearly is not really being learning much from what we should have learned by now, I think is the best way. I also one of the things I was thinking about, I read Johnny Appleseed this year, which was the Canada Reads winner, which is a fictional account of a First Nations young man who ends up traveling between his reserve and the city. And when I saw the cancellation last week of the Greyhound bus route, well, the Greyhound altogether, I remember turning to my husband and just saying, oh my gosh, like, this is Highway of Tears. Like all we've done is recreate that, because the reality is the Greyhound bus service so many communities in northern parts of every province, which are primarily housing our Indigenous population. And they are now without any kind of means of transportation from traveling from community to community in many cases.
Mhm.
And that my fear is, well, our fear is that this cycle continues, without bus service. We also, Melissa brought up just the issues with clean water, that we're breaking, we're breaking people, just simple human necessities, simple human needs are not being met, and they continue to not being met.
Mhm.
I don't know, Melissa, do you want to add anything else? Talked about, go ahead.
No, I think you did a great job of summarizing it, and we were just saying it's an act of resilience. But the struggle with this is it's an act of resilience among thousands of wrongdoings that are probably, thousands that are happening every day to this day. So it's not, again, it's similar to the other themes. This is not something that just happened in the past and you move on. We're continuing to continue these horrible trespasses against people even today.
Mhm.
I mean, to think this is 9 years ago.
Yeah. I think
that's sad.
The specific examples you bring up, I really appreciate, because a big worry of mine while doing these workshops is that statistics kind of take over how we think about what is currently happening and what continues to happen, and that we need to remember that there is always a face and faces to all of these numbers. And yes, the number tells us a lot about things, but forgetting the faces, forgetting the stories is another act of violence that we can easily stop from happening. Well, thank you all for participating in this activity. I'm just recognizing the time, and I'll start to wrap it up. I know that a lot of this information is extremely heavy and hard to handle, so I hope that you are all able to take a rest, make a cup of tea, cuddle up with your kids, anything like that, something that will bring back some feelings of humanity for you after hearing all of this information. I know that can be kind of tough. And again, just a reminder that you have access. Maybe Ian, I can send you this document and you can email it out again, because I'm happy to share this information, and in hopes that you all continue to share this. I know that we didn't have that much time for questions for me, but I'll also give you my email address to send to folks. It's julia@canadianroots.ca. I'm available anytime for questions, whether it's tonight, tomorrow, next year. You can ask me questions whenever you'd like, and I'm happy to have conversations about things. And yeah, I think a big takeaway from this workshop is that there is a lot of history that is happening, that has happened, and we can't know it all, and that's okay. But we continue to do this work so that one day, in hopes, or hopefully, it won't have to be done anymore. And that's why I continue this work, and I hope that you carry that sentiment throughout your days and your lives, that hopefully one day we won't need to do this anymore. So yeah, I'm available all the time. If you would like to continue chatting, you can always email me. And yeah, I hope you all have a great night. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Julia. This was so wonderful. I want to remind everyone that Julia will be back in 2 weeks for our third session, our third and last session in our Indigenous Learning Series. It will be wampum education with a particular focus on the 2-row wampum and the dish with 1 spoon wampum that govern our particular area in Toronto. And it will explore the understanding of expectations and meanings around treaties. So yeah, I hope you will all join us then. if you've registered here, you'll get the link. If you register for this one, you'll get the link. If you haven't, then and just showed up because you saw the posting on Facebook or Twitter or wherever you found it, let us know and we'll make sure you're on the list so you get the Zoom link for next time. Okay, thank you everybody. Miigwech.
Gretch.
Hi, everyone.
Bye.
Hi, guys. I hope that you liked that workshop. I know that it was like really participant heavy, but I think that that's like a